Well, hopefully that's given time for everybody to make their teams work and to be able to log in. And thank you everybody for joining us today for this webinar that's part of the CoStar network. Just a few bits of housekeeping before I introduce today's speaker and we begin with the actual presentation. Obviously, if you want to find out more about the CoStar network, you probably all know this, but you can find us online at ukcoastalresilience.org. Please do make use of the website. There's lots of information there. And if you want to find more out about what we're doing and what events we're planning, etc., all the information is available there on the network website. In terms of the presentation today, just to let everybody know, it is being recorded. All of your cameras and microphones are off automatically for the webinar because there's a lot of people here, and that just makes it a little bit easier to manage. But it is all being recorded and that will be available afterwards. So when it comes to questions, I'd encourage you to think of questions and to ask questions. And the best way to do that is to put that either into the chat or the Q&A function that there is on the webinar. If you're logging in through a web application, you probably can only see the chat. If you're logging in through Teams on your computer, you probably also see the Q&A function. That gives you a little bit more flexibility for asking questions, but use either route and we'll take questions from people there. Good. Well, we've got more than 60 people here, so we will make a start. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Sorry, get my technology working right. So I'm very pleased that Professor Kate Spencer is with us today from Queen Mary University of London, and she's going to be talking to us today about coastal legacy waste and the barriers to climate adaptation. So I think it's going to be a really interesting talk and lots of information and policy information as well for everybody to think about. Kate's going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So as I said, if you have questions for Kate, please feel free to type them during the presentation and we'll pick those up at the end. So lots of opportunity for discussion and chat after we've seen the presentation. I'm going to stop presenting now then and hand it over to Kate, who will take over.
Just about afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I am going to share my screen, and I believe. Okay, does that work?
That's perfect. Thank you very much. That's great.
Brilliant, thanks. So just to kind of say, I can't see chat or anything while I'm talking, so I won't know if you do ask anything or try and stop me. So thanks very much for inviting me to do this. I'm going to give a kind of a primer, really, on where we are in terms of understanding the sort of impacts, potential policy management implications and implications for coastal adaptation associated with legacy landfill and coastal waste. So I'm going to cover a lot of material, but hopefully in sort of like an accessible way. And really this is a summary of sort of over a decade of research that we've carried out at Queen Mary, but also recognising, you know, that there are other research teams and other research groups kind of working on this now, and also that it's reaching a little bit of a nub in terms of interest kind of within government. There's been a recent kind of post note, and I will also introduce that and talk about the the general problems. So as I say, we've been working on coastal waste sites for over a decade now, actually. We have a current project funded through, funded alongside the CoStar network, funded by the UKRI, but our previous work's been funded by NERC, the Environment Agency, Syria, a number of local authorities, and we are currently collaborating with Glasgow, Sunderland, King's, and University of Bradford. Right, so as I say, this is a primer. What is historic landfill, legacy waste? These terms are used interchangeably by myself as well. I do kind of trip over sometimes and use slightly different terminology. But essentially, we are looking at old landfill sites that are within the coastal zone. And just to give you a picture, for me, this is where my research all started. This is a site on the Thames estuary. You can see in the top right hand corner that we are just meters away from the water's edge. And on the left hand side, you can see an old landfill site which is already eroding and releasing very visible material into the coastal and estuarine zone. But more specifically, the broad term legacy landfill, we are referring to old landfill sites that predate modern legislation that would have required the isolation of wastes from the surrounding environment. So not a specific coastal issue, but you know, a landfill definition. The term historic landfill, which I do use interchangeably, is very specifically an Environment Agency definition. So these are sites that no longer have a waste management license. And so this means that in England and Wales, we are looking at sort of around about the mid-1990s when the new waste regulations were introduced. That puts significant regulatory pressures on landfill managers, and so landfill managers were given the option of basically handing over their license and their responsibility. So very broadly, we are looking at old landfill sites that tend to be pre-mid-1990s, and they don't have the kind of engineering techniques or options that were put in place to protect the surrounding environment. So they tend not to be lined, they tend not to have leachate management systems or methane gas management systems, and also because of their age, we often don't know what's in them. There's very, very poor records. If there were any records, they were often paper-based, they've been lost, so that really makes managing them really, really challenging. When we talk about coastal landfills, again, there is no actual kind of definition, but certainly the work that we have done is that we are specifically looking at wastes that are at risk from coastal hazards. So we are looking at wastes that are at risk of sea level rise, at risk of tidal flooding, or they are at risk of coastal erosion. More broadly, if we're using this sort of term legacy waste, we might also start thinking about kind of brownfield sites or made ground. A lot of these wastes tend to be very inert. So whereas the picture that I've showed you looks grim, you can see sort of plastics and and material that looks as if it is likely to be harmful. But a lot of this material could be made ground and seen actually as being very kind of inert, kind of like inert materials. So we started asking the question, well, back in the, the project that I had funded by the Environment Agency and by NERC, which was sort of like in 2015, 2014, we were like, well, actually, how big is this problem? We know of a handful of sites, a small number of sites that appear to be problematic. But what is the scale of the problem? So we did some work with the Environment Agency. This work was published back in 2017, actually trying to understand the scale of this problem. So how many of these old landfill sites are there? Well, the map in the bottom right hand corner, every single blue dot on that map is an old landfill site. So it is an old historic landfill sites in the Environment Agency historic landfill data set, where we don't really know what's in there. It's not lined. We don't have leachate management systems. We don't have capping systems in place. And there are about 20,000 of these old sites in England and Wales. But we were specifically interested in the coastal sites. So we did a load of work with the Environment Agency, and we started refining that and trying to look at sites that were in either flood risk zone, tidal flood risk zone, or coastal erosion risk zone. So our work, and then also some early work by the University of Southampton. And we started to kind of get a ballpark figure of around about 1,700 sites in tidal flood risk zone or on eroding coasts. The work that we're doing in our current project has started to extend that work up into Scotland. It's been a little bit more challenging, really, just because of how the data is stored and managed. You know, that there aren't these sort of like national national data sets. I've also added here DEFRA 2026 because I am aware that there is ongoing DEFRA work actually with the University of Hull to you know, kind of refine this, you know, even kind of, you know, to get a better accurate number of sites, and that work still isn't complete to my knowledge, which is why I've kind of just highlighted it in red. But what I do know from sitting on that steering group is that this number is very, very indicative, and is a very good was a very good early approximation of how many sites might be at risk. The Committee for Climate Change back in 2018 identified that there were probably about 3,000 hectares of contaminated land at coastal flood risk, and work carried out by the Local Government Association identified that about 50% of coastal local authorities were concerned and identified that there were coastal landfills within their regulatory boundaries that were already eroding or were at risk. We also know, anecdotally to an extent, that there are probably thousands of additional brownfield sites, undocumented sites, and illegal sites. And certainly, you know, over the last, 6 months, we have been seeing a lot of stuff in the news about some of these illegal landfill sites that are popping up around the country. Some of them are really really significant. And really, I just thought this is kind of like a fantastic quote from the Environment Agency, was how we manage our waste legacy. So these old landfill sites, in the context of climate adaptation, whilst we protect communities and the environments, is a burning imperative. And this really is a very significant issue. So I think highlighting the scale of the problem, recognising that it is indeed a really significant issue. It's been fantastic to see this recent post note, and perhaps that's kind of why so many people are here in this talk today, is that we're really seeing kind of like elevated national concern about this issue of legacy landfill sites. I've put the link here in the talk, and obviously you're recording this, and this talk will be available. A recent post note. This isn't specifically coastal, but I've summarised some of those key findings. I gave evidence to. I said quite a lot of time talking to the authors and giving evidence for this post note. And basically, the key findings are that there is no clear evidence of harm to human health. The UK Health Security Agency have done kind of quite a lot of work on this. They say that there's no clear evidence, but they also provide a lot of caveats, which are that data are missing, particularly for coastal sites where coastal flooding and erosion will present new pathways for pollutants. So it's really a lack of evidence to demonstrate human health, rather than a definitive there is no harm. And the report also recognises that climate change, whether that's through flooding, erosion, but also increasing things like storm surges and also kind of wildfires, are going to multiply and amplify these risks, particularly over the next decade. The post note also summarises that there is real limited remediation or potential for remediation of high-risk sites that have low development value. And I will come back to some of the management options that are suggested in this post notes. But really recognising that we don't have the funding mechanisms in place to remediate these sites, even if we do identify that they are high risk, if there is low development value. And that presents a particular challenge for our coastal sites, because by the fact that some of them are coastal and already at flood and erosion risk, then we have limited development value. I'm aware that this is quite a broad audience, so we might ask the question of why on earth did we put all of these old legacy waste sites in the coastal zone? Well, one, easy transport. It was very easy to, take our rubbish down our estuaries from our big industrial areas, from Liverpool, from Manchester, from London, and transport it out to sea. Coastal environments were undervalued. We certainly didn't recognise or value them in the same way. We didn't fully understand the risks of climate change. So this was, a lot of these sites were put in place in the middle of the 20th centuries, and 20th century, and we certainly weren't anticipating erosion of landfill. Sorry, erosion of the coast. And also, these old sites were based on natural attenuation. The idea that as leachates were released, migrated through adjacent soils and the environment, that any contaminant risk would be significantly diluted or dispersed before those pollutant loads reached our surface waters. And in this instance, they would be coastal waters or estuaries. We didn't really have a good idea of how long that would take. Certainly there was, I've heard it explained to me that it's just kind of like an experiment, and we started the experiment before actually knowing when the end point would be. And I think that there has been some work, not by our group, but for example by the BGS, by Dan Goody, that's tried to understand, well, actually, how long does it take for these wastes to fully degrade and to fully become inert? And a lot of these materials will never become inert because we have things like forever chemicals and heavy metals. But even after decades, some of these old sites are still releasing ammonia as they degrade. So that's why we put them in the coastal zone. So a lot of our early work was trying to understand the potential environmental impacts. And we thought of a number of potential scenarios. So we've got all of these old landfill sites. We're pretty sure that they are going to contain a wide range of wastes just because of their age and their industrial and hazardous content, but also that we weren't regulating what could go into landfills, certainly not in the early to mid 20th century. And we have worked, this work was funded by the Environment Agency quite a while ago now, where we excavated a load of sites. And we basically found out that even sites where waste had been buried for 60, 70, 80 years, if we were to re-release that material into the coastal zone, to flood it, for example, with coastal waters, we identified that pollutants would be remobilised. And this, this is there. This just kind of gives you, some data for, oh, I've lost my labels. I think this is lead, arsenic and zinc. Sorry, cadmium, lead and zinc. I sort of lost the labels to say which is which. And what we did was to compare to the waste acceptance criteria, because that's also one of the big problems is we don't actually have any environmental, we didn't know what environmental sort of standards to use, because this is was sort of an unknown problem. Like, what happens if a landfill erodes and releases material into the sea? What guidelines do we even compare against? And we compared to the waste acceptance criteria. And we tried flushing our waste materials with river water and with seawater. This is two different, different sites. And we found that, not for everything, but certainly for our more mobile contaminants like cadmium, that even though these materials have been buried for decades, if you start flushing them with salt water, you would re-release material. And actually, even, I think this is for zinc, is that, if we were to apply those waste acceptance criteria and know that our sites would be flooded with salt water, we would not be permitted to dispose of this waste in the coastal zone. And of course, these landfills contain materials that we know have now been banned. So things like asbestos, and they also are highly likely to contain emerging contaminants and forever chemicals, things like PCBs. There is some recent work, I thought I'd updated this reference. There's been some recent work demonstrating that PCBs are released from these sites, and there's also another reference, and I will root it out if anybody wants it. Another group, not our group, have already shown that PFAS are being released from coastal landfills. So there is, significant likelihood that if these sites flood, we could release contaminants. A caveat here, which is that we looked at sites that contained industrial and hazardous waste. Certainly not all coastal landfills are going to fall into this category. We've also shown that if sites erode, then any wastes that they contain can be released to our coastal environments. So some of the sites that we've been working on, we've identified asbestos, plastics, medical waste, old batteries in the coastal zone. This was some work that we did kind of more broadly on a number of sites around the coastline, where we looked, again, focusing very much on those sites that contained kind of mix of industrial and kind of hazardous wastes. And as you can see here, this is actually 4 different landfill sites. So one up in Lynmouth that contains sort of more kind of mining wastes and industrial wastes. Walney contains domestic wastes. Lyme Regis and Tilbury contain a mix of domestic and hazardous. And what gets released is really variable. We've got data here for arsenic, copper, zinc, and lead, but all of these sites, if they erode, they're releasing something that breaches our ecological guidelines. So for Tilbury, we're releasing really high concentrations of copper, zinc, and arsenic. For Walney, this is a site that is now kind of being managed, quite low levels of most of our contaminants, but even Lyme Regis, which actually some of our PhD students were presenting some of this data at the Fossil Festival last week. So this is also a big sort of tourist area. Even a site like Lyme Regis, we're seeing quite elevated concentrations of zinc and lead in the materials that are being released. The work that we did with the Environment Agency was also trying to understand, sort of more broadly, what the ecological impacts might be. And we identified, hundreds of environmental designations that are either within or very, very close to legacy coastal landfill sites. Over 120, triple SIs are, either within or in close proximity to coastal landfill sites. So, and again, this data set and this number is being refined as part of the ongoing project by DEFRA, which isn't published yet or out yet, so I can't present the data. But again, you know, this work from almost a decade ago, this was published 8 years ago, gives actually a highly accurate estimate of the kind of number of environmental designated sites that are in proximity to our legacy waste. I always feel a little bit guilty because it's a lot of this early work that we did that has kind of raised the interest, you know, with DEFRA and with government, and, you know, and has led to things like this post note coming out. And I am aware that a lot of it kind of does sound quite alarmist, you know, and you know, we do have to, you know, bear in mind some of the potential future scenarios. So, you know, this is, you know, kind of worst case scenario. What could happen if a site containing domestic wastes, hazardous waste, industrial wastes is eroded and released into the environment? And this is a landfill in New Zealand, in the Fox River landfill, where in 2019 there was an extreme flood. The landfill tailings failed, and landfill waste was, you know, 130,000 kilos of industrial and household waste was released and polluted over 60 kilometres of coastline. And just this one landfill alone resulted in a cleanup bill of 3 million New Zealand dollars. And we've got, you know, thousands of old landfill sites. I mean, our work has suggested about 1 in 10 might be at risk. So this is potentially a significant problem. So what can we actually do about it? Well, our early work back in 2017, we were, when we first started doing this work, we were lobbying the Environment Agency and DEFRA around the need to prioritise resources. Clearly, not all of these sites are going to release that kind of catastrophic level of pollution. But the problem is that we didn't know which ones would. And so we proposed some early approaches to how you might go about prioritising sites. This is some early work that we that we published. Some of that is in review as well. There's been some more recent work by Riley et al, and there are some other publications that kind of go with that. But this idea of, you know, if there are all these sites and we have limited resources, which ones do we tackle? And the problem with our approach, and I will absolutely put my hands up for this, is that whilst this work has triggered additional funding and sort of kind of DEFRA response, we don't actually know what high risk means, and all of this is very relative. This is certainly our work is very much a kind of a relative approach, that if we do have some resources, where would we focus them first? But this work causes huge problems for landowners and communities. This is a relative ranking, and how do we work with our landowners and how do we work with our communities if we don't have the resources, the policies, and in some instances the practices in place to actually tackle these sites? And that is going to be a huge barrier to coastal adaptation. So it is going to be absolutely critical that that many of these sites do indeed erode. that many of these sites will end up eroding because they are on sites where we have no active interventions. They contain materials that are not going to be high risk, that are not going to cause big sort of pollution problems, and we are going to have to kind of to live with this. And this really has been the work that we're doing in our current projects. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So this is going to be a big barrier to coastal adaptation. As I say, there has been some definite investment in this. There is ongoing work at how do we develop and refine a prioritisation scheme, but also certainly the current research project that we have recognises the huge challenge that this is for landowners and communities in terms of how do we then tackle these sites. So broadly, we have already had a lot of policy workshops. We've done a lot of work with stakeholders, with landowners, with site owners, to try and understand what the potential actions and the potential solutions might be. And for the vast majority of sites around the country, it is going to be do nothing, minimal clear up, perhaps just dealing with aesthetics, working with communities, working with stakeholders, working with landowners to understand and communicate the fact that risk is low. We also know that certainly in Northern Europe, Flanders and France particularly have done a lot of work. They used the same, they adapted our methodology, and they've already applied the same kind of ranking and prioritization. They are already targeting some sites for landfill mining, for example, and they are also removing and remediating wastes. So France particularly has prioritised very significant funds to do this, and they really are leading the way in terms of how to manage and remediate these wastes. And then, of course, probably one of the most effective approaches, and where we already have sort of funding and policy mechanisms in place, is to use nature-based approaches to reduce erosion. So the waste may remain in place, but we cut off one of those pathways on one of those routes into the coastal zone. So our current project, which is the project that as I say, is running alongside COSTAR as part of the UKRI Resilient Coasts and Communities project, specifically to try and understand the interlinked risks between flooding, erosion, and legacy waste and legacy pollution, and to develop a toolkit of sustainable interventions for people and the environment. And we are doing this as a very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach. And one of the things that we have really recognised is that if we just deal with this as being an environmental or an engineering problem, we are not going to come up with sort of economic tools that will work, because many of these sites are, they are they are low development opportunity, and our current funding mechanisms are really based around development opportunity. We really do have to think much more kind of holistically about the potential values and the potential harms of these sites, and the sort of the interlinked consequences of either allowing sites to erode or defending them. And this is an image from one of our first policy stakeholder meetings. We held one in England, we held one in Scotland. The findings from that are, are being written up at the moment. But this really kind of showed us that our stakeholders are well aware of these problems, and actually we do know what to do about it. We've got, we have the technology. We know how to manage these sites. We have the techniques. We have the engineering techniques. We just don't have the funding mechanisms or frameworks in place. Our current project is looking at 3 key areas: east of Scotland, southeast England and southwest England. We're dealing with a range of sites. I've put our QR code up there if anybody wants to keep my time, who wants to have a link to our website and see what's ongoing. And we've really tried to look at representative sites here. So I've really focused very much on which is how I came to this, the nasty sites, the walking along coastlines and seeing asbestos and medical waste and old batteries on eroding coastlines. And certainly in the last few years, I've realised that fortunately they really are the worst case scenario sites. And so we are also working within this project at looking at those sites that are not going to be hazardous if they erode. And how do we work with our communities and our landowners particularly? And this, we have some very big national landowners for whom coastal waste is an issue, the Crown State or kind of like National Trust. And we are going to have to work with these organisations to think about how we communicate this range of risks. Summarising kind of where we are, particularly from our stakeholder, our policy stakeholder workshops. You may or may not be able to read that text, but there is no designated funding stream to manage the impacts of legacy waste, and remediation is going to be hugely costly. We need to find more innovative and transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary ways of valuing these sites and also understanding their harms and their consequences. Much of the coastline is not defended. And so our shoreline management plans do not really currently include coastal waste within them. The latest adaptation progress by the Committee on Climate Change is quite limited or partial in terms of managing flood and coastal risk where waste is present. And also the adaptation policy is still really kind of siloed into different policy groups and policy working groups across governments. And so, for example, we have things like the National Adaptation Plan, we have our climate change risk assessments, and we have chapters on managing coasts, and we have chapters on managing waste, dealt with by very, very different teams, and we need to work out how to integrate across those areas. And just kind of want to finish off then, I'll leave this here just for a couple of moments if anybody wants to grab that QR code. I know this is going to be shared, so I won't go onto the references page. There's a wide range of references there, both from our work, but also some of the other research teams' work that I have shared. Okay, that's sort of half an hour, 35 minutes. I'm going to stop, and that should give us lots of time for questions.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. That was a really interesting and engaging presentation on the problems that we're facing with landfill at the coast, and I think a great coverage there that gives everybody a good overview of the issues and potentially some of the solutions, or at least some of the things that we have to be thinking about. And it's obviously going to be a big problem for coastal communities. It's great we've got so many people here. We had over 80 people in listening to the presentation. I'd really encourage people to ask questions. If you could type them in on the chat or the Q&A function, then Kate will be very happy to answer them. I was just wondering what, just before sort of begin with questions from the audience, what is your experience when you've been running workshops about the view of the view that the public have, or the coastal communities facing these landfill? What do they say about them, or what's their views on them?
So I won't give specific sites, but we've been doing a lot of kind of community engagement work recently at some of our sites, and I think there's I think there's a real kind of communication challenge, because when we've spoken to landowners, whether that's local authorities or sort of other sort of like independent landowners, there's obviously huge concern that about how this kind of information will land with their communities, their kind of constituencies, and other organisations. But actually, the work that we've done with communities is that they are actually much more pragmatic. They do want to understand if there really are significant human health risks. But I think the fact that this is it's our waste, it's not, we are all sort of part of that, part of the problem. And I think that this is a really visible way of, because I mean, I've gone to these sites and I can see, things that I would have thrown away as a child. We're sort of like part of the problem. And actually their response is like, let us know, let's work with you, and let's work out how to, kind of like how to solve this. And we've actually it's been hugely optimistic, actually, working with our local communities.
That's good, thanks. So a couple of questions here. One from start with Dragana Vidovic has asked about whether you've seen any differences between modern regulated and legacy historical sites in relation to either human health or wildlife health.
So we have not worked on modern sites. We really have very much focused on these legacy sites. But I do know the report that came out from the UK Health Security Agency, and I've kind of worked with them on this, which is that the evidence of basically well-managed modern sites, the human health risk is seen to be very very limited. But the concern is, and I think the language that the Health Security Agency used was, I think, poorly managed or unmanaged sites. So that really is, looking to these, legacy sites where there's limited information. And of course, I mean, really prominent in the news at the moment is illegal sites, where we just don't have any, information. So yeah, if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And then a question from Julie Bremner about what knowledge is there on the ecosystem impacts of these coastal sites? So, for example, can you see evidence of impacts on water and sediment quality or in coastal species?
Right. So then I think this is when it kind of becomes really challenging in terms of evidence. So in terms of things like sediment quality, is yes, where sites erode, we have noted that the release of contaminants can lead to elevated sediment concentrations that could cause ecological harm. But that's not evidence that there actually is harm. And I would say we're really lacking, lacking that information. Also, some of the work that we have done has, implies that actually with dispersion and dilution, even when quite contaminated sediments get released, as long as those then get dispersed and released into coastal waters, then those kind of levels of pollution could the loads could reduce kind of quite quickly. But I think we I mean, it's part of some of our ongoing work, and I know we aren't the only people who are looking at this now. I mean, I think this is a critical knowledge gap that we need to understand.
So another question from James Tristan. Did you find out when you were looking at the sites that you've investigated, did you find out any details about ownership? So some of them you've certainly, you mentioned a moment ago there were local authorities involved, but I guess sort of private landowners, have you been able to find out, or I guess there are lots of sites where it's unknown who owns the land or has the responsibility?
So our starting point, I mean, we're co-funded by DEFRA, we're working really closely with the Environment Agency, so our starting point has always been data sets, existing data sets. So they're, like kind of landowners are known because, for example, it's in the Environment Agency's data set. But the longer I work on this, the more we are finding, particularly small sites, that there are a significant number of sites that are not present on those data sets, which means that we don't necessarily know, kind of like no ownership. But again, kind of one of the biggest challenges of this project has been, because of the potential implications for landowners, private landowners have been really reticent to let us kind of access their sites. But actually, and again, I'm not kind of like naming sites at the moment, but actually sites where we have worked, where particularly we've got sort of lower risk, and actually we're showing that the environmental risks are really minimal. So actually we need to be able to work positively with those landowners. But yeah, I think whilst we have the current sort of regulatory approach to environmental harm and demonstrating environmental risk, this is a really challenging area for landowners.
And a question from Marie Hannon at CFAS is there any data or GIS maps that are publicly available on the location of these sites and their risk index?
Not yet, I don't think. Certainly the work that we did, that we published back in 2018, that has got, so that was the work we did on ranking. That has got a spreadsheet on it. That's in the supplementary information. You can go and you can access that, and you can see, you can see a whole load of data there. The paper that we've got that's in preprint, and also I kind of think, because as I say, like there are different approaches, like nuanced approaches to doing this. I think the Riley paper that I put, I think you can also access a spreadsheet in their supplementary information. And of course, loads of these data sets are, they're in the Environment Agency's domain. So yes, they are accessible. But yeah, I think we need it. So yeah, but yeah, as I say, that's individual kind of responses, and I think what we really need is that the outputs from the DEFRA work.
Yeah. Question here from Chris Wilson. What do you think are the realistic next steps for local authorities or government who are likely to now be responsible for those historic landfill sites? What would you say they should be doing?
I think we need to be helping local authorities in terms of how to do climate change risk assessments for these old sites, actually understanding how do you do risk assessment. And I know we're working with a number of local authorities where that is potentially an issue and potentially a concern. I think we need to lobby for some central funding to support those local authorities where there is an issue. I think we need to be working much more strongly on that, and partly I feel I'm part of the problem, which is the helping local authorities communicate the risks, because many, in fact, the vast majority of these sites will not be causing will not be causing significant harm. And I think we need to be working with our local authorities on, how do you work with your communities? How do you communicate, kind of communicate what's going, what's going on. And next steps, I think we need to be thinking more holistically and more creatively about how we value these sites, so that we can put sort of funding models together to help manage them.
There's a next question. I think you sort of answered the bit about data sets. Maybe more interestingly, do you have any understanding of what the relationships is between the landfill sites and coastal erosion? I guess maybe both are. How is coastal erosion a big problem? I guess, for landfill sites, but also do they influence coastal erosion?
Some previous work that we've done, because we asked the sort of question, is like, do these sites, destabilize our coastlines? But I think it's what you're asking. How do these waste materials behave? Because they aren't, they you might argue they're geomaterials, but are they behaving as a soft sediment coastline, or how are they actually behaving? Are they more or less stable than other materials? And we haven't published this yet, but these materials essentially are eroding much like a sort of a familiar sort of soft sediment cliff erosion model. So no, I don't think they're well, we don't have the evidence. I don't think they're enhancing erosion. So yeah, does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Sorry, just trying to pick out some of these longer ones. So I think a question about which sites you might be looking at. So in the post note, there's obviously, it shows that there's a cluster of landfill sites in the industrial north, west and east. And in the RACC website, you're looking at certain data sets. Are you looking in particular at any data sets in the northwest?
No, we're not. There's what we didn't want this project to be, this current project to be, was just to be a collection of more and more data. There've been several, several research groups now kind of working on this for, we're getting on for a decade. I can see Mark Stratton's comment in here as well. It's we didn't want to just collect more and more data, so we've specifically chosen sites that are kind of representative of the breadth of the challenge that we've got. So we have got some sites that contain industrial hazardous wastes, and they are eroding, and they are releasing potentially quite harmful materials. But we've also got sites that are right at the other end of the spectrum, sites that are containing materials that may look, may not look particularly pleasant, but they are not chemically or biologically particularly harmful. We're also trying to look at a range of sort of kind of community issues as well. So we're working in areas where we have lots of tourism, and and there are those kind of pressures. We're also working in areas that are very industrial and that perhaps not many people live. So what we've tried to do is to try to understand the breadth of the challenges that are going to be faced by our local authorities, rather than looking at these sort of we aren't prioritizing sites for remediation. We're trying to kind of look at the breadth of the problem, and how do we tackle those kind of different issues.
Yeah. So question here, I think the interpretation of the question, you were saying the majority of cases perhaps the risk is relatively low, but there are obviously cases where caveats about that there are risks to human health.
Yeah.
But do you think under a changing climate with more hot weather, more coastal erosion, do you think it will still remain the case that risk remains low, or is that in itself likely to expose, I guess, more high risk?
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly you know, why, you know, DEFRA are trying to look at, you know, sort of, you know, what's this situation look like now? What will it look like, you know, in under various kind of climate change scenarios? And I think, you know, I mean, the post note makes it very, very clear that climate change is going to, you know, multiply these risks. We are going to have sites that are currently not at flood risk that will become, you know, at flood risk. You know, and it's also, you know, on our changing kind of you know, kind of management. So yeah, it's a dynamic it's a dynamic problem.
Another one here about sort of ownership. Would you be optimistic about future collaboration between agencies, owners, and communities in terms of managing these sites? Do you think that there is a path to that happening?
I mean, we are you know, working with some site owners now. I think we need to do a lot of work around that kind of communication, you know, that kind of, you know, that sort of messaging, and we still are open, you know, open to landowners you know, coming forward. But yeah, our sort of independent small landowners are very nervous.
Do you think you gave the example of sort of that people are thinking of mining waste sites in other countries? Do you think that's something that would be feasible in the UK in the near future, and would it potentially add to contamination risk, or would it be a benefit?
So I mean, I'm just kind of wondering, because I can see you might be not able to ask this, about to ask this, but I can see there's a few questions here about kind of that sort of costing, like the economics. And I think the issue with landfill mining is also about you know, kind of like economics, and you know, our sort of and actually, yeah, we've got a whole work package which is looking at, you know, how do we you know, develop sort of more kind of holistic approaches to understanding and valuing, you know, valorizing, I should say, possibly more than valuing the harm caused. And yet we are, you know, we are doing some work that looks at the, you know, scenarios of what happens if we do manage this site, and also what happens if we don't, in terms of cost to you know, costs to natural capital, costs to ecosystem, you know, ecosystem services. And I think much like, I mean, some of you you know, may already be familiar, but one of our, you know, our key project partners is Larissa Naylor at, you know, at Glasgow, and she's done an enormous amount of work you know, around coastal erosion, and recognizing, you know, that you've got to bring you know, you've kind of got to bring communities into that, you know, into that discussion about how you manage these sites, and that is exactly what we are you know, we are attempting to do. So yes, specifically if you think about landfill mining, and we've argued this for a while, is that if you just base it on economics, it is not viable to yeah, to landfill mine. But if you can also think about the costs of not doing it, you know, in terms of resource recovery, it's not, you know, it's not viable. But if you can also think about it, the costs of not doing it, you know, the potential impacts on our natural capital, on our ecosystem services, on human health and well-being, then you can start to build sort of like economic models.
A question here, maybe whether you might be able to answer something about what's happening in France, and whether do you know anything about the amount of resources they're putting into doing this type of work? Is it comparable to what's going on in the UK, or is it being less intensively studied?
So I can't give you a figure off the top of my head. I mean that they are they're working with us there in terms of project partners. But I mean I think Macron pledged several years ago a very significant amount of funding to remediating these sites. And yeah, and actually somebody showed me a article in a French newspaper recently about how a site was being cleaned up and was being remediated. So yeah, I think they are significantly ahead of us actually.
I think we're sort of almost to the end. There's one question about whether you know anything about the situation in Northern Ireland, whether there's any data available there, or is that still an unknown?
We haven't yet. Yeah, I don't know.
And nobody.
I know we've extended to Scotland. I think Southampton might have done some work in Wales as well to extend that in terms of numbers. And certainly, I know the data are out there for Wales because I've seen maps.
And maybe just as the last question, just trying to interesting presentation. It is in the latest project is the fixation on development value of land as a marker of remediation potential of landfill sites being considered as part of the assessment for vulnerability. That makes sense. Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
So in the project is looking at development value of land as a marker for remediation potential being considered as part of the assessment of vulnerability. So does that feed into the policy regime of deciding whether sites are vulnerable or not?
I think there's probably people in the room who are better equipped right. Better equipped to answer that. But I mean, development is in terms of vulnerability. I don't know, but it's more about where do the funds come from, and that a lot of funds to remediate contaminated land are driven by development and development value. And if you've got a site that you aren't going to build on because it's at erosion and flood risk, then that funding source is missing. But the work that we've got ongoing at the moment is a bit more broadly trying to understand how we can value these sites in different ways in terms of their end uses and to use that as part of a sort of a funding strategy, an economic framework.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, I think we'll sort of draw things to a close there. You've done a great job answering a huge diversity of questions there. I think I've covered most.
Yeah, sure. Can I just because I'm also picking up on Tim, our project manager, is in here. I think we've got a series of 4 of these talks, and I've tried to present the kind of the overview, but we have done a lot of work on policy and policy development and working with stakeholders. I think we've got that upcoming as a talk. We've talked a lot about the economics. We are going to do a seminar, I believe, down the line on kind of how we value value both harm caused and also and potential value and sort of end use of these sites. So yeah, we will have some webinars hopefully in the future that will answer some of these questions. They won't be by me; they'll be by my colleagues.
No, that's great. No, and once again, yeah, thank you very much for really, and it obviously has sparked lots of thoughts and discussion. As you say, there will be more webinars in the future on sort of some of the specific topics that people are raising and going into those in more detail. So I'd encourage everybody to keep an eye on the website. We obviously send out emails to people when we're running these webinars. So sign up when you see one of these that's of interest to you. And once again, thank you for so many people for turning up. And taking the time to listen to Kate and find out more about the RACC project. So thank you again for an excellent presentation. And just to remind everybody that these webinars are a sort of regular series in terms of what CoStar does. We'll be taking a bit of a break over the summer, but we'll be letting you know about the next webinar in September very soon. Okay, so thank you very much, Kate, once again. A great presentation and really interesting and thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.